You count your children's fingers each morning. You count them again before bed. It's such an automatic habit that you probably don't even notice you're doing it. For most of human history, that counting carried a different weight than it does for you. Historical demographer Nancy Howell spent years living among the Hawansi people of the Kalahari Desert in the 1960s, recording births, deaths, and family histories one household at a time. Her research suggested that in some traditional foraging populations, close to half of all children born didn't live to see adulthood. Half. Sit with that number for a second. Not because it proves ancient parents loved their children less than you love yours, because the opposite is closer to true. This is the detail that gets me every time. The more fragile a child's survival actually was, the more evidence we find of parents fighting for them anyway. Let's go back further than the Kalahari. French paleodemographer Jean-Pierre Bouquet-Appel studied skeletal populations from the Neolithic period, the era roughly 10 to 12,000 years ago, when humans across Europe and the Near East began shifting from foraging to farming. His research pointed to something that sounds backward at first. Farming didn't just mean more food and more people. It also appears to have raised infant mortality in many early agricultural communities, likely because settled village life packed families and their animals close together, and crowding spreads disease in ways that a small, mobile foraging band rarely experienced. Why would settling down make things more dangerous for children? Think about it. A forager camp of 15 or 20 people moves every few weeks, leaving waste and sickness behind. A farming village of a few hundred people stays put, generation after generation, on the same patch of ground, next to the same stored grain, the same domesticated animals, the same latrines. Bouquet-Appel's data, and the work of researchers who followed him, describe this as part of the Neolithic demographic transition, a period when birth rates rose alongside these new risks, producing more children overall, even as a larger share of them didn't survive early life. Bioarchaeologist Sharon DeWitte has spent much of her career reading exactly this kind of story written in bone. Her work on medieval English cemeteries, particularly populations affected by plague and famine, documents infant and child remains in numbers that would be almost unthinkable in a modern hospital record. Some of these figures are genuinely debated among researchers, and for good reason. Infant skeletons are small, thin, and poorly mineralized, which means they simply don't preserve as well in the ground as adult bones do. Archaeologists widely suspect that the true rate of child death in most ancient and historical populations was even higher than what survives to be excavated and counted. The evidence we have is very likely an undercount, not an exaggeration. Here's a question worth pausing on. If child death was this common, did ancient parents simply get used to it? For decades, one very influential idea filled the gap left by that uncertainty, and it turned out to be mostly wrong. In 1960, French historian Philippe Ariès proposed something that reshaped how a generation of scholars thought about the past. He argued that because child death was so common before the modern era, parents protected themselves emotionally by not investing too much in children who might not survive. Grief, in his telling, that was something of a luxury, a feeling made possible only once mortality rates dropped low enough to make loss rare and shocking rather than routine. It's a tidy theory. It fits the numbers on paper. It's also, according to the researchers who actually went looking for evidence, mostly false. Historian Linda Pollock tested Arias's claim directly. In her 1983 book, Forgotten Children, she went back to primary sources, personal diaries, letters, and private writings from parents across several centuries of English and American history, and read what people actually wrote in their own hand when a child died. She didn't find detachment. She found devastation. Parents described grief that reads exactly like grief you would recognize today. Sleepless nights, guilt, years spent mourning a single loss, children remembered by name decades after their deaths. The emotional record simply doesn't support the idea that high mortality numbed people to loss. So if grief wasn't muted by frequency, what actually happened inside a community when a child died? Let's reconstruct a moment. Picture a small foraging camp somewhere in the deep past, maybe 15 or 20 people, a scatter of simple shelters. A fire kept burning at the center. A child in the camp has died. Sickness is the most likely cause, since across most of human history, disease and complications around birth killed far more children than predators or violence ever did. The mother does not grieve alone in a private room, the way modern grief is often structured. Anthropologist Alyssa Crittenden, who has spent years studying the Hadza of Tanzania, has documented just how communal Hadza childrearing really is. Infants and young children are held, fed, carried, and watched over by multiple adults and older siblings throughout the day, not exclusively by biological parents. This pattern of shared caregiving, sometimes called alloparenting, shows up across many foraging societies, studied by anthropologists, and researcher Kristen Hawkes has argued it may even help explain why humans evolved unusually long post-reproductive lifespans, grandmothers who help raise grandchildren, freeing mothers to have more children sooner, an idea known as the grandmother hypothesis. It remains an active area of debate among evolutionary placents, anthropologists, not a settled fact, but it points to the same underlying reality. When a loss happens inside a tightly interdependent group like this, it isn't absorbed by one grieving parent alone. It moves through the entire camp. The archaeological record backs this up in a different, quieter way. At the Neolithic site of Çatalhöyük, in what is now central Turkey, archaeologists led by Ian Hodder excavated the remains of an enormous, densely packed farming settlement occupied roughly 9,000 years ago. Among the finds were infant burials placed carefully beneath the floors of family homes, not discarded, not distanced, but kept physically close, sometimes for generations, as families continued living and cooking directly above them. Whatever these ancient parents believed about death and the afterlife, the archaeology doesn't describe people treating their children as forgettable or replaceable. There's another layer to this that rarely makes it into the popular version of the story. Child death wasn't the only risk hanging over these camps and villages. Childbirth itself was dangerous for mothers, in ways that are easy to forget from inside a world with modern obstetric care. Estimates drawn from historical and ethnographic populations, including demographic patterns documented in Nancy Howell's research, suggest maternal death during or shortly after childbirth was a real and recurring possibility, not a rare tragedy. A surviving child, in many of these communities, often meant a mother who had already faced down one of the most dangerous events of her own life to bring that child into it. That context changes how you should picture the emotional stakes riding on every single birth. It also reshapes how you should picture the community around that birth. Anthropologist Polly Wiesner, who has spent decades studying the Jew, Hoanzi, has documented how central storytelling, gift exchange, and long-distance social networks were to daily survival in Kalahari, foraging life not as charming cultural color, but as a practical safety net. Families maintained relationships across dozens of kilometers, specifically so that, if drought, illness, or loss struck one household, others could share food, labor, or simply presence. A child's death inside this kind of network wasn't absorbed in isolation. It triggered an entire web of obligation and support that modern nuclear households, however loving, often don't have built in by default. Here's the counterintuitive twist that the Endriel research actually supports, and it's the opposite of what pop culture usually assumes about primitive people. High child mortality didn't make ancient parents love less. In many documented cases, it appears to have made loss more visible, more communal, and more ritually significant than it often is in the modern world. Precisely because loss was a constant possibility rather than a rare and isolating catastrophe. That doesn't mean any of this was easy, and it's worth being honest about that too. Researcher Nicholas Blurton Jones, working alongside demographic studies of the Hadza, found infant mortality rates in some documented hunter-gatherer populations, reaching into the double digits within just the first year of life alone. No parent, then or now, absorbs that kind of repeated loss without carrying real and lasting scars. Some ethnographic accounts even describe deliberate emotional guardedness around newborns in the earliest days of life. Before a name was given, or a birth was fully counted by the community, a possible, though debated, adaptive response to genuinely uncertain odds, not evidence of indifference toward children who survived infancy. And this is exactly where the honesty has to stay in the picture. There is no single, universal, ancient human's experience of child death to point to. A Kalahari forager studied by Nancy Howell in the 1960s a Neolithic farmer at Saddlehoyuk 9,000 years ago, and a plague-era English peasant studied by Sharon DeWitt lived through very different risks at very different rates, shaped by different diets, different diseases, and completely different social structures. Flattening all of them into one generic, the ancient story erases exactly the kind of regional section and historical variation that researchers spend entire careers trying to reconstruct carefully, piece by piece. What actually connects these very different populations isn't a single number. It's a pattern that keeps reappearing across widely separated times and places. Careful, deliberate infant burials. Grave goods placed with small bodies that offered the dead nothing they could ever use, except as an expression of love. Oral traditions and, later, written records describing mourning periods that stretched on for months or years. None of this points to numbness. It points to people who loved fiercely, inside conditions that you, reading this now, will almost certainly never have to face yourself. So what actually changed between then and now? Mostly, it was medicine, sanitation, vaccines, a working understanding of germ theory that didn't exist for most of human history. The dramatic decline in child mortality over roughly the last 2 centuries is one of the most significant and strangely one of the least celebrated achievements in the entire span of human history. It's the specific reason a parent today can reasonably expect, almost as a default assumption, to watch a child grow into adulthood, something that was never a safe bet for most of the humans who came before you. In almost any time or place, researchers have been able to study. But here's what the evidence suggests hasn't changed, as far as bone, ritual, and handwriting can tell us across thousands of years. The instinct underneath that quiet morning habit, the reflexive check, the small worry you don't even register as worry anymore, isn't a modern invention. It isn't something that only became possible once loss became rare enough to be safely felt. Researchers keep finding evidence of that same instinct in carefully placed burials beneath ancient house floors, in grave goods a family couldn't spare but gave anyway, in the handwriting of parents who buried children of their own centuries before anyone reading this was born. You count your children's fingers each morning. Somewhere, in a foraging camp, in a Neolithic farming village, in a house with a small grave beneath its floor, someone else did exactly the same thing.